This lecture in international finance, we will be talking about the international bond market. So this is just some market information at a glance. So uh, the uh, the distinction between a domestic bond and domestic bond markets and international bonds really has to do with, for the most part, the currency that the bond is denominated in. So if I'm an American firm and I issue a bond that that will give me American dollars, U.S. dollars, and I pay interest in U.S. dollars, and at the conclusion of the bond, I pay principal in U.S. dollars. That would be a domestic bond, right? Wouldn't be relevant to the international. I mean, it's relevant to the international market, but it wouldn't be an international bond, right? It would be sold in a domestic bond market. An American company could issue a bond that that pays the initial money raised was US dollars, and then interest payments are made in euros, and a final principal payment is made in euros. Right, so in that case, those bonds then would be international bonds. It would be an international bond because it's a euro bond. So euro bond meaning specifically that the bond itself is denominated either in principal or in interest, or both, typically, in a currency different than the domestic issuer's home currency. Right? In the U.S., we don't have a ton of need for this relative to the size of our domestic bond market. But you can imagine if you're a company operating in, say, the UK, right? There's a really good chance that a lot of your revenue is in euros or in US dollars. And so making payments in pound sterling on a loan might end up creating transactions costs, right? Because you might be collecting in euros, and then you have to turn those euros to pounds, and then churn in the pounds to the bank. So it can be, just from the sake of minimizing steps and minimizing costs, it can make sense to issue a bond that pays interest and principal in a currency you actually happen to be accumulating, right? And moreover, the euros that you're collecting from your European customers are not useful for paying your domestic British workers or British contractors. The reality is you probably have a much larger fraction of your expenses that are denominated in pound sterling, whereas the bulk of your revenue might show up in euros. And so having a euro bond, a bond denominated in a currency other than the local pound sterling, can be a useful vehicle for those companies, right? So there's lots of reasons to issue bonds with international currencies. And so you can see, so in terms of domestic bonds versus international bonds, the domestic bond market is, about 4 or 5 times bigger than the international bond market. So, and that to a great degree, obviously the U.S. is a huge issuer of domestic bonds, and so, the fact that maybe in Luxembourg they might have a higher fraction of international bond issuance, that's going to be tough for them to make a dent relative to the United States because they're so much smaller, right? So the domestic bond market is quite a bit larger than the international bond market, right? On average, companies are issuing domestic bonds more than international bonds, but international bonds are still significant, right? This is still very large. This is 23 well, if you go to 2021, the last the last data we have from our text, we were talking about $27.5 trillion of international bond issuance. So this is not a small number. And you can see that this bond issuing has increased over time, significantly, at least in the last recorded 5 years, with domestic issuance growing faster than international issuance, but international issuance is still growing. So let's talk about some terminology. So a foreign bond is a bond offered by a foreign borrower to investors in a national capital market and denominated in that nation's currency. Okay, so if I'm a German multinational and I'm issuing dollar bonds to U.S. investors, right, that's a foreign bond. And so from an American perspective, right, I'm paying dollars and receiving, right, so I'm paying dollars and then I'm receiving dollar interest and dollar principal. So the only difference between a domestic bond, from my perspective, is just the nationality of the issuer, right? So I'm dealing with a German issuer, and so if I have, and in particular, this matters in default. So if my German issuer misses a payment or something, right? Then I need to, then the lawyers get involved and we have to figure out what happens. And the fact that it's a foreign issuing entity can affect the legal domicile of the dispute, right? So if it has to go to German courts to resolve, well, that's probably fine, but you can imagine there are definitely countries where trying to get local legal enforcement can be, almost impossible. So even though in this case the currencies are all, from the perspective of the investor, the currencies are exactly the same as they experience in a domestic bond, legal enforcement can be different. Okay, so that's a foreign bond. That's in contrast to a euro bond where, is denominated in a currency but sold to investors in national capital markets other than the country that issued the denominating currency, right? So we've got this currency difference. So the example from the slides, a Dutch borrower is issuing dollar-denominated bonds to investors in the UK and some other places, right? So we have a Dutch company, but they're creating these dollar bonds, and so they're collecting, right? So they're paying dollars, and then these companies in the UK and Switzerland are receiving dollars from this bond, and this can be really, that can be really convenient from the perspective of a European, both borrower and lender, and that pretty much everybody has a use for U.S. dollars because it serves as an intermediary between a lot of different currencies, right? If I'm a Dutch firm and I want to transact in basically any currency in the world, I will have to route through U.S. dollars unless I can just use the direct euro market. So there's lots of good reasons both to be borrowing dollars and to be paying in dollars because we, will tend to have them on hand. And but right, we're talking about from the U.S. perspective, a foreign country borrowing from an entity in a different foreign country, but the borrowing and payment currency is the U.S. dollar. So that's how it has, this, I guess, the foreign nature of the currency relative to the issuer makes it a Eurobond. So about 80% of international bonds are Eurobonds. So they're, again, the bulk of international bonds are of this type where we've got this currency difference. And there are a few really common currencies to utilize for Eurobonds. The US dollar primarily, but also the euro, the British pound, the Japanese yen, and the Australian dollar and the Swiss franc all have these have currencies that are utilized in Eurobonds, and that's different than the issuing location, right? So France, for example, or Germany, the Netherlands, UK, right? The UK, I guess, right? Well, I guess these are all, I mean, they're all major issuers, and these countries all have their currencies represented within that pool. But the um, the 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 but they're issuing bonds in currencies other than their own, right? So it's like kind of issuing in each other's currencies. So yes, so this is the total dollar value of these over time, and you can see, right, the distribution of international bonds, right, denomination currency. Dollars and euros are really common, and basically competitive in terms of total investment. And then the other ones mentioned are smaller by quite a bit, right? So pound sterling is sort of the biggest of the little ones, and then yen, Australian dollars, and Swiss francs are all kind of in that same smaller size. And then all the other currencies across the entire world basically rate about as much as the bottom three in that pool combined. So it really are just a few currencies that dominate the euro dollar bond market, and that makes sense because those currencies are the ones that would be most useful to be either paying or collecting in. So this is the currency of the bonds, and so now we can go see the issuers, and right. So you can see the issuers, of course, are a much more diverse group, right? We have, just for example, China, major issuer of euro bonds. Their domestic currency, though, is not one of the popular ones. So they're issuing in one currency and getting somewhere else. I guess when we come back, we'll talk about some institutional structure around how these bond markets operate.